year or so ago, you said. You artists have a different sense of time. That show ended in February '96. But it's seared into your memory, and I consider that flattering. It's great to be back here. I mean that because, I don't know, I have a weakness for artists, and when your artists, that is the ones I normally study, are at least 300 years dead, you don't get to sort of ask them questions and see how they respond to things, or to sort of, talk about Vermeer and then have the guy say, I never did that, I never thought that, or whatever. But it's harder on critics, but it's like a lot of historians, I have that fantasy that it would be nice to go back sometime and to talk to these people, ask them questions like, did that room really exist? And did you, arrange those models and so on? And we may as well put on a couple of slides and look at that kind of thing. I think the basic reason that I study Dutch painting as my main field, and I have a lot of artistic, I have an interest in a lot of different fields. When I was an undergraduate at Rutgers, people like Frank Stella and various hard-edge painters, color field painters like Liedtke and Kenneth Noland, and all of these people were the latest thing and overtook the Whitney Annual and so on. I was very much a formalist back in those days of the late 60s and early 70s. But when I went to graduate school, I was fascinated by Degas, Manet, other people of the 19th century. Not so much Impressionism, although that was part of it, but Impressionism always seemed a little too easy for me, and I know that's kind of stupidity, although I reserve still thinking that about Renoir. Monet, not so much. But the point is, I became fascinated by problems of representation, and then I was fortunate enough to get this bee in my bonnet about going to the Courtauld Institute after Brown University, largely because the teacher I had at Brown went there himself, and it seemed to be a good idea if you were an American who had never been out of the country to get a little exposure to other cultures, and even Europe, if your field was European art. And at the time, when I was at the Courtauld through the early 70s and lived in Amsterdam and in Florence for a while, I was mainly in London. And at that time, Ernst Gombrich was a big shot at the Warburg Institute. Of course, he's still alive and still influential, but he was a regular teacher back in those days. And on roughly the third reading of Art and Illusion, I started to understand the book, which is deceptively simple. And it's basically about how representation, trying to transcribe what you see in the environment, always involves conventions, or what is more fashionably called today, or was at least 5 years ago, picture making, or that kind of phrase. But you as artists know quite what I'm talking about, I think. Conventions of composition, or color, or lighting schemes, and of course conventions of meaning, standard themes, in this age, of course, standard symbols, and so on. And I've always been exceedingly visual. I think it has to do with overexposure to television between the ages of 0 and 15 or something like that. It must have been around the age of 15 that I started reading for the first time. And now that is the dominant mode, but it's in, there are people who are dominantly literary and others who are dominantly visual or musical or whatever, and it can be really hard to talk to the other personality type about certain things you see in a picture. Certain people are very inclined to simply read the narrative of a picture, and if you say, well, isn't this the most Hohlt-like Vermeer you've ever seen. And there he goes again with that left corner room, and the wall is receding on the left, just like it is in 14 other Vermeers. And in fact, it's the same window in this Berlin picture, open at the same angle, that is in the Glass of Wine by Vermeer of about the same date, around 1659, in the museum in Braunschweig, Germany. So what's the deal here? I mean, did he leave the window at that angle in his studio for a month at a time, or whatever? And of course, I don't think so, but people as recently as the 1930s and 40s did think so. A Dutch scholar named Peter Swillens, for example, worked it out that Vermeer changed the floor tiles in his room about every 5 years, and the window sash carpenters came racing in, changed the windows, new style of windows every 2 years or so. Seems like a rather expensive operation when you're an artist. You can just make this up. This is, just to clarify, this is the Glass of Wine by Vermeer of about 1659 in the Staatliche Museum in Berlin. It's a canvas, well preserved, about that size or so, and it will be in our exhibition in March 5, one of the late successes. In fact, I mentioned Braunschweig. Those guys in former, no, actually it's not. I was going to say East Germany. There is something provincial about it, but it's not East Germany. They strung us along for about a year, oral reassurances. And fortunately, they really screwed us in the end after a year of promises. It's marvelous how critics in the newspapers or people coming to your exhibition say, well, why didn't you get the view of Delft? Or why didn't you ask for that? You know, when you were badgering the person with faxes and emails for about 2 years, and pulled every string and had ambassadors calling up their ambassador, and, you know, more dirty tricks than Nixon and whatever to secure these pictures, you know. And I mean, I feel like reacting sometimes. You know, damn, why didn't I think of the view of Delft? I missed it. People really ask questions like that. So anyway, what happened here is that I've known this guy in Berlin for 20 years, and I just finally, in August, and the catalog was over in September in terms of adding things to. This is a 640-page catalog, so it has a long production. We print in Singapore, has to come back by ship. We watch our expenses, so it's not a rush schedule, and teams of editors and so on. So all of this, we have an enormous lead time, especially compared to European museums for the production of the catalog. So just this August, I said to this guy in Berlin, I told him the whole story about how Braunschweig had done us in, and that triggered this happy ending of, oh, well, okay, it's just been to Amsterdam, but you can have the glass of wine from Berlin, which is the one I always wanted in the first place. The Braunschweig one was just a substitute. So anyway, back to that question about realism. Did this room exist, and did these models hold these poses for approximately, I would say, about 2 months, which is what it must have taken Vermeer at a minimum to paint this picture, possibly 3. The 34 Vermeers that we know of now in the world, I believe about 25 of them are recorded in their own time. 21 of them at an auction in 1696, about 20 years after Vermeer's death in Amsterdam. And we now know, and probably you know as well, that that auction was the household goods of a man named Jacob Decius, who was the son-in-law of a minor nobleman, man who inherited a lot of land and money, who lived in Delft, named Peter van Rauven. And because van Rauven was actually dead when this man married his daughter, and of course they have different last names, the connection between the two was only made in the 1980s by the Yale economic historian who's fascinated by Delft, Michael Montius, who you may know wrote a book called Artists and Artisans in Delft of 1982, and Vermeer and his milieu in 1989. So I would say that there were originally probably no more than about 45 paintings by Vermeer that he actually painted in his rather short career. He died in 1675 at the age of 43, and we don't know any paintings before the age of 23 or so. So it's 20 years, and given their technical sophistication, the extreme care with which Vermeer thinks and paints and seems to do anything, he really is that kind of personality. He probably did an average of 3 or at the most 3.5 pictures a year, and they must have been quite expensive because he was largely supporting a family of his wife and 11 children surviving at the time of his death. They probably had 14 or 15 in those 20 years. This seems the point to mention that he converted to Catholicism to marry this young lady. And you may know that he lived in the house of his mother-in-law, and his mother-in-law had a pretty good inheritance, and so that gave Vermeer a roof over his head and so on. But he really did not have sufficient income just on the side to live off, not from the mother-in-law and not from the well-known inn that he inherited from his father. It's often said that when Vermeer's father died, he inherited this tavern on the square in Delft. And I can point that out in a photo later on. But in fact, this was a sort of 2.5-story building, very small, like many buildings are in Delft. It must have had 3 or 4 rooms to rent upstairs, and was mostly about beer, wine, and food downstairs. There's no way that Vermeer could have lived there without taking away about 1/4 of the income of the place. And his mother and his sister, his only living sibling, ran that place until 1668, I think, was when his sister dies. And it wasn't until that time that it was his, and then he immediately leased it to someone else. So he wasn't really making much money on the side. He was making money mostly from his own pictures, and probably, like most Dutch artists at the time, dealing in the works of other artists in a minor way out of his own studio. His main line of support was this man, Peter van Rauwen, who thought his first Vermeer is, in all likelihood, the Met's own Maid Asleep in the Altman collection of about 1657. And the last one we know of is The Lace Maker in the Louvre, which is about 1670. So that's only a span of about 13 years, where one man in Delft bought about half of Vermeer's production, to judge by the inventory of the sale in 1696 and the surviving pictures, of course. Here's a detail of the window in this picture, which I guess would be about 6 inches high, crest of Delft in it, but not of Delft, but of a Delft family. And more importantly, above this crest, there is a woman in blue with a kind of red skirt. You sort of see right through her in the light, and of course, look out the window. But she's an allegory of temperance, holding a bridle, which is rather abstracted, and that identification has been doubted. But I wrote a book on equestrian portraits and monuments, and I'm just not going along with this doubts. To me, it's a typical big bridle of the 17th century, which is on the right part of that oval in the center. And this man is offering this woman a glass of wine, and I think we can read a lot into their relationship and a lot into Vermeer's observation of people as well as space and light. The way he stands very close to that woman, almost, waiting for her to set that glass down and, oh, you want some more? And you want some more? And you can see she's sort of taking it that way. I mean, this is not a throw your arm over the back of the chair position. She seems kind of contained and wallflowerish, and you might almost think that she's taking a sip of wine because there's an awkward pause in the conversation, or a lot of them. The chair in the foreground and the way that the cittern propped up on it faces her suggests perhaps that the man is advancing from another flank. It's very common to court a woman in this period by making beautiful music together with ambitions to do so metaphorically. It's often a metaphor for lovemaking. And Vermeer has arranged these things. I don't have to tell artists, I'm sure, with considerable care. If we look at the figures, one thing that fascinates me is this kind of, I don't know if I'm just reading too much into the picture, but this graph of movement from the picture to the glass, the way the folds in the man's cloak almost seem to suggest this marionette-like action of turning with the picture to the glass. But there are many more formal niceties in the composition, the way the chair, for example, spreads the space in the foreground, and that's picked up by the diamond-shaped tiles, the way the cittern's neck points into the corner to that pillow, and then there's this kind of clockwise motion in the back of the chair. The cittern's neck is picked up by the lion head finials and kind of carries your eye clockwise into those sheets of paper on the table, and then by that time you're into the pitcher, which is a wine pitcher, white Delft ware, and is framed in this kind of nimbus of linen that comes out the cuff of the man. You can see it, I guess, much more clearly here. It's a striking idea, isn't it? To frame this white thing with this sort of white halo of linen, which accents that motif. It's the sort of pin in the carousel of this picture. Things sort of slowly turn right around that picture, and the figures almost seem to be standing on a floor or in a corner that could gently move. And again, you see this kind of arrangement by Vermeer of a strongly receding wall on the left, and then open space to the right. And of course, we read pictures generally left to right. The light falls from left to right in, I'd say, 95% of Dutch pictures, and Vermeer makes the most of that. And if you reverse this picture, it's not really necessary, but it's an interesting game if you have a book of Vermeer to put a mirror next to the image and see what they look like in reverse. The psychology between the figures and the whole sense of space would change quite a bit, and it would certainly be less illusionistic. I'm also struck by this kind of recession of the tabletop, which goes into that landscape on the wall, kind of vague Jacob van Rysdale kind of landscape. It's almost like the naves in church interiors, pictures of them during this period, and the way they lead into the choir space at the end. Vermeer has learned these various tricks of perspective by looking at painting a great deal more than he was looking at an actual room, I think. Here is a painting of basically the same theme, but much earlier in Dutch painting. This is by Judith Leister in Haarlem around 1630. Again, it's a courting couple with music and wine, but you can see that the tone of these two pictures is really very different. Another thing I'm fascinated by in the study of the history of art in general, and particularly Dutch painting. Dutch painting is so frequently close to direct observation that it really presses the issue between observation and conventions of picture making. It's on that fine line of a great observer. And of course you could say this about Degas, Cézanne, Picasso, a lot of very different artists, but Vermeer is clearly one of those. To me, he is one of the most refined artists artistically, an extraordinary observer, but an extremely subtle and fine-tuned aesthete in the way he designs his pictures. And perhaps that's evident in this fairly conventional Baroque arrangement of these two figures, and what Vermeer does with that same thing. By the way, the fact that Vermeer had a patron who was willing to pay him a quarter or a third of a year's income, and that man lived in Delft, and he acquired maybe 12 or 13 Vermeers as they left Vermeer's easel, probably 18 by the end of Vermeer's life. This is an extraordinary thing. I mean, this man can really get to know the artist, and Vermeer doesn't have to remember his work. In the case of most Dutch painters, of course, they didn't have books and photo archives and so on. And we today look in a catalogue raisonné of the landscapes of Jan van Goyen with 600 images in it. And we have by far a better visual survey of that artist's career, or even each year of it, than the artist himself ever could have had. Most of those products just went off in different directions. But here Vermeer did have, in many cases, the ability to go to that house in Delft, or frequently another house nearby in Delft or The Hague, and see earlier examples of his work, so that the letter reader in Dresden, or a man and woman drinking wine, he could see very closely how he treated that theme before. And that's part of the reason for the very tight evolution that you find in Vermeer's pictures. Anyway, one of the received notions in Dutch art history is that realism dawned in Haarlem, where Judith Leyster and her husband Jan Molenaar, and of course Frans Hals and his brother Dirk Hals, and a lot of landscape painters came from. It dawned there in the 1620s and 30s with middle-class people like good Americans of the 19th century, also who just wanted to see their environment, their countryside, their still lifes, their grandmother's face, and that kind of thing. And they weren't too sophisticated about art, but they knew what they liked, and what they liked was observation. That is the kind of old-fashioned line on realistic painting in Haarlem, and that the next generation or so, by the time you get to the 1650s in Delft with Peter de Hoek and Vermeer, Delft is the heir to that realistic development in Haarlem. And people have asked themselves, how did this happen? What is the connection between the Haarlem school, which seems so realistic in the early quarter of the century, the first half of the 17th century, and Delft in the 1650s and 60s especially. Before I get into that notion, I just want to show you that this rather varnish-laden and dirty picture on the right, in the physical sense of the term, has been cleaned for our exhibition. Whoops, there's another Haarlem painting by Dirk Hals. And this is what it looks like now, more or less, within the limits of color photography. That's a bit too blue, but you'll see the real thing. When you go to museums today, and of course this is a habit that curators in particular develop more so than teaching art historians, but I don't mean to fault them. I mean, many of them are objects people too. But when I go around different museums, especially museums I've never been to before, the first 30 to 60 seconds of looking at every picture in the place is a kind of condition check for me. It's automatic. What is the evidence in front of me? Now, when you go to the Hermitage in Russia, you don't even have to think. Everything's dirty and yellow, and as a result of not cleaning it for 100 years, probably fairly well preserved. And it hasn't been in that many collections. The more a picture moves and changes collections, the more threatened it is by frequent cleaning, especially canvases. But here's a good example of that. I mean, before you talk about the golden light in this Vermeer, and maybe he's influenced in this case by Paulus Potter, and he's moving in a different direction and developing a warm tonality, you might just question what's the condition of the picture and how long has it been since it was cleaned. Now, to return for a moment to that question of Haarlem and Delft, this is another Haarlem painting of a so-called married company of the 1620s, so about 30 years before Vermeer. One of the discussions in terms of the advance of realism, and of course this is a story, an approach to art history that we inherit from Vasari. He's basically the first guy to write in these terms in the 1550s and 60s about Michelangelo and Raphael and so on. And you all know that he begins basically with Cimabue, and then Giotto comes along and figures are round. And then Masaccio comes along and rooms are in perspective. And then Raphael comes along and figures are graceful and they have convincing movement, and Leonardo comes along with light and shade and so on. It's all a kind of progress in terms of physical description. And the Vasari of the Netherlands, Karel van Mander, who wrote a book inspired by Vasari, the Schilder book or painter's book of 1604, takes the same approach. And if you look at your standard textbooks of the 1960s and 70s, like Fred Hart or Arneson or Jensen or Gardner or whatever, they basically take the same approach too, at least when they get to Renaissance painting up to about Picasso or so. And there's some truth to it, but obviously progress has more to do with, well, it's not progress at all, is it? I mean, it's different cultural values. The Egyptians were far more schematic and abstract, less convincing as naturalists than the cave painters that were several thousand years before them. The Egyptians were not stupid. They were organized. They had a different kind of society and wanted different things out of pictures. But you wouldn't know all that to read earlier history of Dutch art, etc. And it was commonly said that, well, Vermeer learned how to create a room convincingly. This guy in Haarlem is typical of Haarlem in that he's basically a figure painter. And you have a kind of screen painted on cardboard for the room that's behind that. It's a sort of shallow stage which wouldn't exist if it weren't for the figures. And for that matter, they too look like cardboard cutouts, and the table's a bit weird. And, you know, you can imagine putting this picture together as a collage and making it work rather like Braque might make still life work, and you don't feel that way about that picture. Obviously, you might want to start with a photograph or a holograph and then start painting after that. So Delft painting is far more advanced in terms of its light and its space and so on. How did this evolution occur? Well, it has been suggested in the past that artists from the north of Holland, and now we need a little bit of geography, Haarlem and Amsterdam are up here, and this is the sort of cradle of realism in the 1620s. You move downward to Leiden, which had defined painters like Gerard Dow and Frans van Mieris in the 1640s, 50s, 60s. Then here is The Hague, the port city and capital, except in the 1650s and 60s when Amsterdam took over. Delft is next to The Hague, and the distance between these two dots here is 3 miles. You walk it in an hour. This is Rotterdam right here, a bit further to the south, and then we don't see it, but Dordrecht and a few other cities down here. Then into the Spanish Netherlands, later Belgium, with Antwerp, Brussels. I don't know what these other things are anymore. Ghent is around here somewhere. Bruges over here. And then Utrecht, the most Catholic city, a former bishopric, is a bit to the east. And this is the province of Holland, now split into South Holland and North Holland, but the province of Holland where most of the major cities were, and the big money. The only other important city in the Netherlands really was Utrecht in the mid-17th century, which lies inward in meadows, and as I said, was the most Catholic of the cities. It's a cliche to think of this culture as entirely Protestant in the 17th century. 1/3 of the country remained Catholic and about 55% of Utrecht. So who brought this realism to Delft? Well, there have been various suggestions, and since they're kind of silly, I'll go through them quickly. One candidate is Nicholas Maas, who trained with Rembrandt in Amsterdam, and as you can see, never got over Rembrandt's contrasts of light and shade, and he is noteworthy for these playing with different rooms, perspectives down and up and to the side and so on. And this is a picture by Nicholas Maas of 1657, when Vermeer is just beginning to do interiors like this. And so maybe he brought this kind of space down from the realistic north to the kind of slow-witted south of Holland, because he moved from Rembrandt's Amsterdam back to his native Dordrecht, which is a bit south of Delft. And as recently as 20 years ago, in books like Peter Sutton's monograph on de Hoogh. Peter, you here tonight? I have to watch what I say. You'll read, like, you know, maybe he stopped in and stayed at Vermeer's father's inn, and, you know, they compared notes, and, you know, as if drinking in a tavern or something was the best way to get to know an artist's work, unless it was that tavern that the painters of New York used to go to in the 60s or the 70s, or Max's Kansas City or something like that. But it didn't work like that back in the 17th century. Another candidate, because he too was trained by Rembrandt in the area of Haarlem and Amsterdam, which is only about a half-hour's walk apart, and similar schools of painting. And of course, I don't have to persuade you that Rembrandt was a close observer of the environment and realistic in certain ways, is of course Karel Fabricius, who comes from Amsterdam, trains with Rembrandt, and then moves to Delft around 1650, where he does his Delft pictures for about 4 years. We'll have all 5 of them that are known to survive in the Delft show, including this very small view of Delft. It's a canvas only 1 foot wide by Karel Fabricius in London now. 1652 is the date, and obviously whatever he's doing here, it's remarkable for space and light and some of the effects that Vermeer develops about 5 years later. Another candidate is Peter de Hoogh himself, a native of Rotterdam, just to the south of Delft, but he trained in Haarlem, cradle of realism, according to many people. And then he moves into Delft because he marries a local girl there in 1654, and he remains in Delft through the critical years of about 54 to 60, when Vermeer's interiors begin, and when de Hoogh himself does closely related views, like this Mary Company in London, a canvas of 1658, which will also be in the show, and we'll see how it hangs next to this Vermeer. It might work, it might not, but we're certainly not going to take this sort of hagiographic approach of, you know, one artist and then next room, next artist. They're really going to be mixed up in a way which sort of happens when all the pictures arrive. At least to some extent, that's true. This picture is, to give you one example of how these paintings are interpreted by still quite modern writers, like Albert Blankert's book on Vermeer of 1978. And he's talking about this kind of Vermeer, but he gives you an illustration of this Peter de Hoogh. And he says, and this is a quote, "Imagine what a sensation this painting must have caused when people saw it in Delft in 1658. Well, you know, what is this? Is this Picasso and Demoiselle d'Avignon? And the guy's locked in his closet for 5 years and then runs to the local gallery, and it's the Armory show, you know, with the explosion in the shingle factory statement about Marcel Duchamp's nude descending the staircase. It's a very modern take on advances in art. And this guy is a officer of the local guild, the Painters Guild. He's hustling pictures every day. He knows every other artist in town. It's highly unlikely that he's doing something that nobody knows about, or in fact that he's doing anything particularly original in terms of the general composition. I mean, these pictures have to sell, so they're already fashionable when they're conceived. This kind of picture with its emphasis on perspective, its light, its tight description, and of course the theme of these gentlemen who are trying to get a young lady drunk and cavort with her. These are visiting cavaliers or off-duty soldiers. The fact that one has a hat on his head, the other in his lap with a ridiculous foppish plume on it, the other woman is a maid. There was a man here standing right next to her, but you can see the black hat and the trace on the front of the mantle there. A figure was removed by de Hoogh, and sort of the bottom of him shows up in black on the tiles there. If you measure these tiles, there's a sort of odd rush to the floor on the right, and it gets lost over here. and say the man's foot is equal to one edge of the tile, and then you count the tiles up, and I've actually, of course, done this. This room has this room has a frontage of about 30 feet. So the house is probably, given the standard design of Delft houses with a corridor and a room on the other side, at least 50 feet wide, which makes it one of the major mansions in Delft. It's got black and white marble tiles, which no house in Delft was known to have in the third quarter of the century. That was, of course, imported from Italy, that kind of stone, and it generally was found only in the town hall or in quite palatial buildings, literally palaces frequently at the time. But of course, it's a great way to make space with a perspective system. And not only is the house rather large, but the woman is at least 7 feet tall, which might account for the men's astonishment. And the man he's got two clay pipes in his hand, and he's sort of pretending to play a violin, so this is a kind of tipsy musical party. The point about criticizing or just analyzing the space is that de Hohlt is still rather new to this. He's fumbling around with the perspective system and the recession of the floor tiles, the scale of the figures, especially the way the floor runs over to the right, the fact that he cut one figure out of the composition after completely painting it. He's finding his way with this composition and changing things, and he's not likely to be the person who formulated this type of perspective interior and then imagine what a sensation he must have caused. I mean, basically he's learned something that had been done quite some time before. For example, if we look at this painting by Dirk van Dellen, who is from rather provincial Middelburg, way to the south on the coast, but he was a big success in The Hague, 3 miles from Delft, in the 1630s with this kind of interior. And this is a married company by Dirk van Dellen, D-E-L-E-N, in the Rotterdam Museum, which is dated 1636. Now there are big differences from a decorator's point of view between the rooms. It's certainly a fancier interior and fancier people on the right. But I think you see the point in terms of this kind of recession of a wall on the left, the use of the floor tiles to create space. This kind of thing goes back quite some time, especially in this neighborhood of Delft and The Hague, and has gradually, very gradually, become more realistic or more naturalistic as artists test these conventions against what they see in their environment. De Hohlt is certainly trying to be more naturalistic, more immediate than these prototypes of the past. But you all know that to speak a language you need grammar. You don't just need the words. And that's basically what he's learning from these conventions of the past that he sees in other artists. They go back further than Van Dellen, another decade back to Bartholomeus van Bassen, a picture that will be in our exhibition because he's from Delft, and this was painted in 1620, a prodigal son picture, maybe prodigal son or a modern version of it, in a very luxurious, fancy interior from the museum in Raleigh, and that will be one of the early Delft pictures that we have in our exhibition. And if we compare that kind of painting with its insistence on space, its very close description, and many other qualities I don't really need to describe, to a Vermeer like this one, the music lesson, which that stingy queen won't give us when it's shown. But despite, you know, it's hard to know who to get to call her. So, you know, what to do. You have to pay Furby to sponsor things, so I just don't know where to go. Alas, you know, it's been in Washington 5 years ago, and you can't borrow Vermeer's just routinely, and she seems to want it for some guest she's having over next year, whatever. But the point is this interest, which is really a connoisseur's taste for pictures that emphasize perspective. There's this young man of 24, Peter Tedding van Berkhout, from a noble family, who goes from The Hague on the local barge, pays his nickel to get over to Delft in 1 hour. They were just running back and forth between the two cities by barge, carriage, or on foot, or horseback, or whatever. sometimes 2 round trips a day between the port city and the market city of Delft, which was had a great market of vegetables and meat and dairy products, and had several industries like beer and linen in addition to the fine arts. Delft was the bigger and more active town, whereas The Hague was a port city with 1,200 courtiers and basically a support community and no industry whatsoever. So this young gentleman goes from The Hague to visit this artist he's heard about, Vermeer, in 1669, and all these guys keep diaries in French, and this one survives. And he says about Vermeer, and this kind of Vermeer would date 1666 to 8 or so, so this is hot off the easel. And he says simply, the most curious thing about these pictures is their perspective. But, you know, you could say that about De Hohlt or church interiors or Van Bassen or a lot of pictures. It's interesting how salient this quality was in the minds of these people at the time, this kind of simple illusion that we now take for granted and in fact, of course, reject since 19th century painting, except for occasional revivals, of course. This kind of thing is very much at home at The Hague. The godfather of all these perspective painters, Fredem and de Vries, a great author on perspective, and this, of course, is basically the Italian Renaissance tradition, moved to northern cities like Antwerp, where Fredem and de Vries was born, but he lived his last years in The Hague, doing pictures like this imaginary palace between 1600 and his death in 1605. He published perspective treatises. You may recognize this plate. It's one of many in his book Perspectiva, published in The Hague of 1604, a kind of how-to book for tiles and furniture and so on. And this is basically an Antwerp tradition. Antwerp was the great port of Europe in the 1500s, the 16th century, 100 years before Vermeer. And it was really the first outpost in the north of the Italian Renaissance. So you can trace the kind of Masaccio, Mantegna, Filippo Lippi thing into painters in Antwerp around 1550 and all the way to 1600 with Fredem and de Vries. And they're still doing it in Antwerp to the south, right at the dawn of Vermeer's career. This is the Antwerp painter González Kock, C-O-Q-U-E-S, in the 1640s, doing a room which, forget if I have the slide right here, but let's just go back for a second. Like this, I think, you know, if this is 1645, that's 1659 or so. There is a kind of interesting regional connection between these pictures. That's going to be a theme too in the show, regional traditions and how artistic traditions in Delft and in its region of South Holland, as it's called, including the port city of The Hague, lead into these great artists of the 1650s like Peter de Hohlt, Vermeer, and Karel Fabricius. And I think it's time to look at the map again. That said, here is that map again, and there is Antwerp, which is immediately below South Holland, and you see Zeeland sticking out in the islands on the left, which is where Dirk van Bellen's Middelburg was. And despite being at war with Spain, which controlled the Spanish Netherlands, later Belgium, artists and a lot of people and trade moved fairly freely between the two countries, and it was not unusual for an artist to go down to Antwerp, and there were many dealers who had connections. So this is part of Delft's own tradition. Delft, if anything, in South Holland, tended to look south to Antwerp and to The Hague for its artistic traditions, and a bit to Utrecht as well. And what all these cities have in common artistically is that their taste is quite international and grounded in the traditions of Italy, the Italian Renaissance and Italian Baroque. Whereas the tradition that Frans Hals and Rembrandt grow up in Leiden and in Amsterdam to the north, is much more indigenous to the Netherlands itself and can be traced back all the way to Jan van Eyck or to later northern artists like Lucas van Leyden, and is more of a local phenomenon. and is based more directly on close observation than it is on schemes of perspective, anatomy, lighting, and things you can learn in the international art market. This is the immediate neighborhood of Delft, and north is to the top as usual, but that's not always the case with maps like this. You see, I've had to turn this map of so-called Delftland, which is equivalent to South Holland on its side. And so here we're in the bottom of that blob which says South Holland. This is Delft right here. You walk maximum hour and a half to The Hague, the port city. This is the dunes here at the beach. This is the present nude beach of Scheveningen, if you're interested. And here is the North Sea. And then Rotterdam is down in that neighborhood right over there. Delft, by the way, is named for this canal cut in a straight line to the Rhine River near Rotterdam, and was called the Oude Delft, which in Old Dutch means the old dig. So Delft just means digging, or something like that. It's named for that Oude Delft Canal, which was built by hand in the course of a couple of years in the 1240s, which put this place on a map, and much earlier so than The Hague. Here is what The Hague looks like in the imagination of a Hager himself. This is a picture by an artist you probably never heard of, Hendrik Pax, in the 1620s, and it represents a cavalcade of orange princes. That is the House of Orange, because they come from their noble lands in the south of France, Orange, which is property they owned originally, but these are the reigning princes and stadtholders, or stateholders, of the Netherlands in The Hague, with a lake that you can still see today. And at the end of the stadtholders' quarters with the square tower is the present Dutch Parliament, which was the Parliament at this time too, in 1620. The major difference between this painting and what you see from the tram as it turns the corner in the center of The Hague today is, well, of course there aren't all those horses there, there's guys with briefcases, and at the end of that row of buildings is the Moritz House, which many of you have probably been to, where Vermeer's view of Delft and other great pictures are. Here is a photo of the stadtholders' quarters not too long ago. If you went into this wing, which was built in the 1620s by one of the princes, Moritz, one of the guys in black on a horse, in this dynastic group portrait. A dynastic portrait shows different generations of a noble house, and some of those people are dead, but no matter, they show up for this group photo or portrait. If you went into this building in about 1620, you would see, once again, this kind of interior decoration by Van Bassen. The actual interior would have marble columns or faux marble columns like this, a coffered wood ceiling, something like this, marble floors, and glitzy silver on the sideboard, striking gilt cups and plates, and obviously rather modern paintings and fancy dress in the picture. You would find objects such as you see on the sideboard. Here is an example of such a thing, a gilt cup made in Delft, as it happens, in 1604 for another town, Amsterdam. Most guilds, this is a centerpiece for a table, and it commemorates, in this case, this is St. George and the Dragon, so it's the Civic Guard of St. George, which was a civic militia company in Amsterdam that commissioned this gilded silver or silver gilt cup, which is about that high, and will be in our exhibition, incidentally, in 1604. Similarly, this salt cellar of 1592, made by Nicholas de Grebber, as it happens in Delft, another fancy piece for the center of the table. Our exhibition will have 93 paintings, 40 drawings, 4 great tapestries, 6 pieces of silver, 10 pieces of Delftware, a couple of bronzes, and a glass. The glass makes the cut because it has the arms of Delft inscribed on it. If you went into the stadtholders' quarters in 1620, you would also see things like this 14-foot wide wool and mostly silk tapestry by the great tapestry manufacturer in the northern Netherlands, Francois Spiering, who was pretty much chased out of Brussels, the other great center of tapestry manufacturing in the 16th century, and settled in Delft because the city fathers were clever enough to give him a confiscated nunnery to set up his workshop. The Protestant governments of the Dutch cities, when the alteration, as it's called, to Protestantism occurred in the 1570s, seized all the Catholic institutions and turned them over into physically productive places, and Spiering benefited from that. So he was the most important tapestry weaver in Northern Europe of the I'd say 1580s to 1610 or so, and he was resident in Delft. And this piece will be in the exhibition. It's about 14 feet wide, and the myth of Cephalus and Procrus. We will also have the two best preserved Northern European tapestries of the 17th century from a private collection in London. These are about 10 foot square. You can see the difference in color. These are tapestries which have almost never seen the light of day and are perfectly preserved, and come from a foundation in London and represent the medieval chivalric romance of the story of Amédée de Gaulle, which is a boyfriend-girlfriend kind of impossible romance. And this was collected at the court of The Hague, and it was manufactured in Delft around 1600. You would also find in the stadtholder's quarters around 1600 or 1620, and here is a view of that same lake from the other direction with the square tower of the stadtholder's quarters in the back left. You would find state portraits like this, Frederick Hendrik, Prince of Orange and stadtholder of the Netherlands. It dates about 1632 and is by the most prolific of all portraitists in the early 17th century in the Netherlands. Not Rubens, not Rembrandt, not Frans Hals, but Michiel van Meervelt, who in his own time was said to have done 10,000 portraits. And I think his studio probably did about 5,000, and maybe Meervelt himself did about 300 of those. But he had a big business, and it was mostly an international court business. He's resident in Delft. There's no reason to move 3 miles to The Hague. Those people are coming to him, and it's a quick trip anyway. And he can always pop over and draw someone's features and do this kind of portrait. Or this kind of portrait, which is Frederick Hendrik's wife, Amalia, of about the same date, 1630. And here's a couple of other pictures you might see in the prince's quarters in The Hague in the 1620s. A history picture, in a sense, by Meervelt himself of 1625, the Roman Emperor Vespasian. Of course, these learned, sophisticated courtiers are crazy for the classics, and this kind of Roman emperors fired their political ambitions. And this exquisite still life by Balthasar van der Ast will have 3 works by him. I mean, if I say still life painting in Haarlem to you, or still life painting maybe even in Amsterdam or Leiden, for some of you that's going to ring a bell. For my own colleagues in the study of Dutch art, still life painting in Delft doesn't ring a bell. But when you look at it, it's a continuous tradition of fine flower painting. Highly expensive products which took a long time to produce, and the objects represented within the picture are themselves collector's items like the painting itself. Wanli Chinese porcelain just imported from China by Dutch ships, shells from the East Indies, from Indonesia, flowers that bloom at different seasons, fruits that are imported from maybe Israel or the Mediterranean or even South America through Antwerp or just recently through Amsterdam. So this is rather sophisticated business, and again, these objects were made in Delft. So I think we're seeing a pattern here after a while, that if you walked into a fancy house or a palace in The Hague around 1620 or 30, just about everything you'd see silver, tapestries, paintings, and a number of other objects would have been by Delft artists. Delft was a town that produced luxury goods for the court, and by the time Vermeer came along in the 1650s and 60s, who in a sense did the same kind of thing, Delft was doing that for nearly 100 years. Also important in this neighborhood, and now I've put the coast at the top of the map. So we're in South Holland, but the beach is to the north, and the real north is to your right. And big H over here is the palace, the princely palace of Hanselersdijk, which Frederick Hendrik built in the 1620s. And right between Delft, which is here, and then 3 miles over to the Hague, near the dunes of the coast, R is the palace of Rijswijk, which is also a princely palace. So there were these great country homes. In the case of Rijswijk, half again closer. So 1.5 miles out of town for these artists. And great schemes of decoration are being done by the House of Orange, these courtiers. And Delft artists, of course, would have sat up and taken notice of that kind of thing. Here is the house of Hanselersdijk. This is a beautiful sort of aerial view before airplanes, of course, were around. It's marvelous how they do this, but that's the H on the map. And here you can see how close it is to those dunes at the coast. The house with all of these formal gardens behind it, and then farmland, and then the beach with the dunes, and the blue business is the water out there. A closer look at the castle remodeled of Hanselersdijk with the formal gardens. Behind it, again, remodeled in the 1620s and 30s, in part by artists from Delft, but also from Antwerp and Utrecht and other places. French architect did the remodeling, a guy from Paris named Simon de Vallée. And this is a closer view of the same house. In The Hague itself was the Huis ten Bosch, where the Queen of the Netherlands still lives occasionally, not the garden building ivy covered in the foreground, but the one in the back right. The house in the wood, or Huis ten Bosch, still survives, and is another one of these country houses of the princes right outside of The Hague. And it has in the dead center of it the famous Hall of Orange, which is a commemoration of the life and death of Frederick Hendrik, who died in 1647. And this was done by his widow, Amalia, around the late 40s and early 50s. This was the latest big thing for the 20-year-old Vermeer in the neighborhood, and it's mostly painted by Jacob Jordans and other guys from Antwerp. Big shots like Van Dyck, who did not work on this project, but did portraits for the court at The Hague as well. This is Rijswijk in plan, 1.5 miles from Delft, and here is a view of the gardens at Rijswijk. So you could walk in 20 minutes from the town hall of Delft to this place, and if you were an artist, some of you did that every morning to do decorative canvases in this building. Here's a little glimpse of life at the court at this time, and I hope this is not your, or I hope it will become part of your view of Dutch culture. You know, this idea that they're all like the people you see in Francois' portraits, and they've got a sloppy beer stein, and they're slapping somebody's derriere in a tavern, and so on, and they're all rather simple folk. Well, that's part of the Dutch story, but there are many levels of society and social planning and different circles and different local traditions. And Delft was a rather conservative and at the same time very sophisticated place. Two adjectives that most Americans, I think, don't traditionally think of as going together. Conservative and sophisticated, or cosmopolitan. Sure doesn't go together with George Bush. Whatever, but it went together. It went together in 17th century Delft because it was basically a town of old money. They knew international art, they knew a lot, and they were interested in the latest art, like, you know, David Geffen, and they were interested in the best of the oldest art as well. And they built these palaces, and Delft is very much influenced by the fact that it's so close to this courtly culture at The Hague, and that itself is a place of old money that goes back to the 1200s. a lot of the major patrons for Vermeer and other people in Delft in the 1600s had inherited wealth and did not much work at all, thanks to the beer and linen industries in the past. These are relatives of the Dutch court. This is Frederick V of Bohemia and his wife Elizabeth Stuart of England. She's Charles I, King Charles I's sister, married this guy from Bohemia, which is today's Czechoslovakia. He came from Prague, and he was nicknamed the Winter King because that's how long he ruled, 1620 to 21, before he was kicked out of his country by a Catholic invasion of the Habsburg Empire. So he went to sponge off his relatives in The Hague, his cousins. So they were part of the court culture of the 1620s, especially Elizabeth Stuart from England, but married into these Dutch relatives and Bohemian relatives. She's clearly not Bohemian in the Greenwich Village sense of the word, but she was the most expensive dame in The Hague in the 1620s and 30s. This gives you a sense of how they traveled at that time. They did not travel like this, but they purchased this kind of thing for formal ceremonies. This caparison, as it's called, which is a parade suit for a horse made in tapestry. I think this is the only commission in history of a decorative blanket and hood done in tapestry for a horse, and originally there were 4 commissioned from Art Spearing, the son of Francois, in Delft in 1620 by the King of Sweden. 2 of these now survive. One of them will be in the first room of Vermeer in the Delft School. So you'll perhaps, or some of your friends who are not here tonight, will walk in looking for a maid sweeping bricks or a maid pouring milk or some nice domestic scene by Hohlt or Vermeer. That's what you're looking for in a Delft show, and you're going to get a wall of tapestry and silver and bronzes and so on. And I hope it upsets the cliches about Delft to some extent. This will be in that first room. Where are we? Okay, let's quickly look at Delft. Here is the center of Delft in a recent aerial photo with the market square. And Vermeer grew up in this tavern right here on the corner called the Mechlin, named for that city in Flanders. And his house was, appropriately enough, replaced, along with a lot of other houses, by this 19th century Catholic church. So he lived just below the new church, which is one of the great old Gothic churches of Delft. Then you have the market square, the town hall, and then the old church, because it dates from the 1200s, not the 1300s, like the new church. And those were the 3 great buildings of Delft at this time: old church, town hall, new church. And then right facing the old church was the so-called Prinsenhof, or Prince's Court, where William the Silent, the George Washington of the Netherlands, liberator of the country and founder of the Orange Dynasty in the Netherlands, the ruling family, or prime minister, you might say. It was a government very similar to England's, with a representational parliament, but also a prince for a figurehead. He lived there in the 1570s and 80s because Delft was a walled city and The Hague was not, and he was assassinated there in 1584 after really at great sacrifice to himself, leading the country in his revolution, and his son Prince Maurice completed it. You would go, if you visited Delft, and almost every diplomatic visitor and courtier at The Hague made this trip by the canals or by horseback to the choir of the new church in Delft, and would see the tomb of William the Silent of marble and bronze, which was built in 1614 to 21. Here's a plan of Delft in the 16th century, actually right after the Great Fire of 1536. The dark buildings are those that survived, and everything else is rubble, which is why Delft is largely a 16th and 17th century town today. It has rather homogeneous domestic architecture. This is reflected in paintings by Hohlt and Vermeer and others to some extent. I just want to walk you around Delft a little bit for a moment. We are here in Vermeer's great view of Delft on that spit of land to the left over there, and we're looking into those gateways that spread like fire tongs to the right, and the gates and that big pool of water that's sort of triangular is right here. So we enter those gates that Vermeer painted in about 1660, and right behind that bridge there, you would see this great armory, which is a national armory of great size, one of about 6 in Delft at the time. This is not the one that exploded. There was a secret armory behind facades of ordinary houses in the northern quarter of Delft, to the lower right over there. And in 1654, some clown out of a Buster Keaton movie walked into that with a lit cigar, and 1/3 of the town died, and all the glass was lost, and most of the roofs. That was October 12, 1654, at about 11 in the morning, and Carol Fabricius lost his life in that explosion, and a lot of other people, and we'll have a number of pictures and drawings of that event in the exhibition. That's one way to renew the artistic community, to blow it up. Vermeer was there, but fortunately Vermeer lived on the south side of town, the so-called Papists' Corner, or Catholic neighborhood at the time. This is the outer Delft, the main drag if you had money in the 17th century, where most people wanted to live, or the street which is parallel to it called the Voorhout, or Front Street. And of course most of you are saying, as you look at that photo on the left, isn't that just like Jan Steen's painting in Penryn Castle? And yes, it is. This is Jan Steen, who briefly lived in Delft, and this is the only painting by Jan Steen, who mostly comes from Leiden and The Hague. The only painting by Jan Steen, this portrait of 1655 of a burgher and his daughter and a couple of beggars that are asking him for charity. The only painting by Steen that has anything to do with Delft, and we see the great outer kirk in the background. And in fact, the tower over his shoulder in the background, beneath the trees, is where the Chamber of Charity met. So I suspect he is a regent of that Chamber of Charity, and we're meant to see with this touching and really quite polite act of begging here that he is one of the officials that's in charge of that civic responsibility in Delft, and obviously his daughter knows how to dress and behave. And the flowers on the windowsill, oddly on the outside of the window, probably a vanitas symbol meant to remind us that things in real life pass away quickly, so we ought to do good acts and get religion, and oh hey, there's that church in the background to remind us. Also, so there's various kinds of symbols in this picture, but they're all worn wonderfully naturally. And by the way, isn't this arrangement of a sidewalk with a front stoop very like Vermeer's corner of a room, with sort of trees and a sky shoved in instead of a back wall? These conventions, picture making, this left corner scheme with a window on the left, they even used them outside as well as inside during the 1650s. It's like fins on cars. There's a kind of look to the decade. That's something of a simplification, but you know, you get the point. Another aerial view of Delft with the town hall and the outer kirk in two views. Leaning tower, not only Pisa has one of these. Interior of the outer kirk, which is very bare. These rather sober Calvinists, you know, they stripped out all of the so-called popish ornament and they whitewashed the walls, moved the center of religion out of the choir to the pulpit, which is on the left of the nave, and then gathered these stools around it and worshiped by largely reading the Bible to people. Here is the what replaces the high altar in the apse of the church, a civic monument, the tomb of the great naval hero Piet Hein, and here an engraving and a photograph of the town hall. I want to briefly show you some of the society that lives in Delft, so you get a flavor of what these people look like. This is the surgeon to the Prince of Orange, a man named Jacob van Dalen, who is actually in storage at the Met at the moment, this portrait by Meervelt. And Meervelt's rather frightful anatomy lesson of Dr. Vandermeer in 1652. And this one is one slide I did not tell Philippe de Montebello is of a painting coming to New York. This will be a surprise, and he's going to ask, what the hell is this doing here? Because he responds to pictures rather in aesthetic terms, but whatever. It's an important part of Delft society, and it'll be your very formal group portrait of a scene of men or doctors who are holding smelling salts and incense and so on. The whole picture is really governed by the fact that there's no refrigeration in the 17th century, which is why they open the stomach and clean it out first. But that's not the point I wanted to make with this picture. The point I wanted to make was that this kind of portraiture goes on for 40 or 50 years in Delft. Again, conservative but sophisticated. You hear on the radio today, this is not your mother's kind of automobile, or whatever. Well, that's one thing Delft patrons never said. This is not your mother's portraitist. Well, it is. Generally, Meervelt would work for 2 or 3 generations of people, and this is a good example of a man of the 1620s and a woman of the 1640s, that portrait of Vienna, from Vienna, which will also be in our exhibition and is by the same artist. Here's a nice comparison between a Delft portrait on the left of the 1640s by a man named Palamedes and Frans Hals of about the same time, which is obviously considerably more animated in every respect and simply not to Delft taste. I mean, if they wanted Frans Hals, they knew him and they would have purchased pictures from him, but that essentially wasn't what they were looking for. Genre and history scenes in Delft, pictures of about 1630 by William van Vliet and Christian van Kelvenberg, respectively. These will both be in the exhibition. A philosopher and his pupils of 1627, and Kelvenberg's Samson and Delilah, which he did for the town hall of Dordrecht, a commission out of town. This is important painting in Delft in the minds of contemporaries around 1630, so one generation before Vermeer, and very much in the Caravaggesque style of Utrecht and Antwerp. This is William van Vliet's allegory of deceit in 1627. Compare an allegory of deceit, in a sense, by Frans Hals of about the same time. This young tavern girl with so-called Janker Ramp and a sweetheart, or a version of the prodigal son, who is earning the affections of a dog and a young lady at the same time, and both of them will be on his side as long as treats are forthcoming. So there is a kind of program of deceit here, but how differently that is kind of staged in the painting on the right with these masks, and everyone is putting everyone else on. Apparently a scholar or a wise man of some kind whose assistant holds up a mask and points to it, a woman who's holding a mask behind her back like Bronzino's Cupid Folly, etc. And then these two foreigners with money bags in the backgrounds, duplicitous merchants of some kind. And I think this is kind of interesting for Vermeer. I mean, this is not Frans Hals, this is not Rembrandt, but it's in their great decade of the 1620s to the 1630s. This is, again, 1627. And just imagine how Rembrandt or Frans Hals would handle a picture like that. But this is the mainstream of painting in Delft in the 20s and 30s. And when you get to a composition like The Milkmaid by Vermeer in the 50s, and you see this firm modeling which comes out of the Caravaggesque tradition of Utrecht and Antwerp and Delft. We didn't really know that, though, until we really do a broader survey of Delft. And you look at this close description and firm line and still life details and meticulous attention to all kinds of visual phenomena, and it's there in Delft already, some 30 or 40 years later. And also the subtlety of meaning. I mean, this allegory of deceit, and what is this picture? If you read Arthur Liedtke's saintly analysis of this picture, this is a kind of Earth Mother of the Meadows, Madonna of the Meadows, pouring milk, wholesome food. You'd think this was Iowa in the 40s or something, but you know, in fact, this is not about bread and milk and sweetness and light and so on, although it's extremely understated and subtle. But for 100 years, Netherlandish artists had been painting rather attractive, if ample, kitchen maids in kitchens, expensive pictures for people who like to, with their fancy hat and sword, stroll back in the kitchen and see if they can drag the young lady upstairs. It's like the films of Fellini in the 50s, or Antonioni, what was it, L'Avventura, or what is the one with the guy in the car, and Jean-Louis Trintignant and so on. Anyway, you get the idea. Here's Franz Snyder's, or some imitator of Franz Snyder's around 1620, with that uterine symbol of the big jug holding it forward, and you see the sort of come-hither look with all of these tasty comestibles, birds and meat and chewy things being carnal knowledge. You don't have to see the film to understand the picture, or you could read the literature of this period. Well, Vermeer, 2 generations later, is still working on this theme, but it is so subtle that I think it triggers in the minds of the observer of the period, surely a sophisticated and rather well-read man, not only desire, but reflections about the fact that he does feel desire for both visual things, for the woman, for the picture as a seductive object that he wants to own. It's very much a fine Leiden picture. The milkmaid, you know, it works well on posters. This is the size of the milkmaid. It's an extraordinary small picture. It's got great monumentality, but it's a very precious, refined object. So I think Vermeer is playing for a rather sophisticated audience that can think in terms of desire and one's own seduction by sight, not so much by the woman, but by the visual world in general. And he turns that traditional sexual kind of picture into something with far greater ramifications. And that's really interesting and requires a certain kind of patronage. A lot of what I'm going to say about Delft in the show is about patronage. And you really have to ask that question. Who are these pictures for anyway? Is one of the first questions you should ask. Well, they're for these people on the left, the Van der Dussens of the 1640s by Hendrik van Vliet, one of the most prominent Catholic families in Delft. And this is going to be in our exhibition also, a canvas about 8 feet wide. And I show you a similarly large picture of about the same time by Frans Hals, man and wife relaxing in their garden or some imaginary garden. And, I mean, this is really a rather rollicking couple. This is, any of you know Seymour Slive and his wife Zoya? Well, you know which one these are. You know, these are people who are very easy to get to know and will drag you out to Martha's Vineyard and fill you full of hot dogs and whatever. And this is more heavy going when you visit these people who clearly have things to say about the proper rearing of children and musical instruments as a metaphor for discipline in the family and harmony of the family, and then all of these Catholic symbols in the background. And again, I find that interesting for Vermeer. This kind of understatement that you find in Vermeer, organized compositions, you might say classical design, light, color. I don't have to describe to this audience the similarities in design, or at least the mutual differences that these two pictures have compared to Rembrandt and Frans Hals, who were just 2 hours travel up the road. And it's not just Vermeer. It's Peter de Hoogh, too, in this surprisingly formal family portrait set in a seemingly realistic courtyard in Delft in this 1658 or so, with the tower of the new church in the background. I know I've been talking a long time. I'll move pretty quickly now and show you a number of wonderful slides of things that are in the show, and I will promise 5 times or so that I'll finish in 3 minutes. 2 more pictures, and I'll just point here is this still life of Van der Asp in the 1640s. I find interesting for this Vermeer of the 1650s. Of course, the room is quite a remarkable thing. in this picture for a setting of this fancy kind of flower painting. Chinese porcelains, precious flowers, imported shells, and so on, relevant in many ways to that precious Dresden reader from Dresden of 1657 or so by Vermeer. Similarly, this still life, I think, has many pictorial values in common with this Vermeer Goldweiler. Both of these paintings will be in our exhibition. Harman Steenwijk, a painting of the 1640s Vanitas picture from the National Gallery, London, and the Goldweiler in Washington, which we don't have time to discuss in detail, but I think you see the point. And also how Vermeer gradually in the 50s and 60s evolves away from that tight tradition of drawing and close observation to a gradually more optical approach, which these two pictures typify. The comparatively early Dresden letter reader of the 1650s, and from the early to mid 1660s, a detail of the picture in our own woman with a water pitcher. And this is a general development in the 1650s towards a more impressionistic, light-filled, spacious, more naturalistic in our sense of the term development in Delft, building on that craft and observation of the earlier period, but really becoming something much more optical. And this is a kind of surprising turn of events in the middle of the century. And basically, and it happens in quite a few artists, like Carol Fabricius and the Goldfinch, also will be in our exhibition, 1654, and this could be a painting painted in Paris in the 1870s and 80s, but it's very typical of Delft at this time. I think this is basically a synthesis of what was traditional in Delft and everything that the northern schools in Holland had achieved. The more realistic landscape values of Haarlem and Amsterdam. Delft in the middle of the century gradually opened up to what all of Dutch painting had been doing. It's a complicated story, and I'm not going to tell it tonight, but you see it fairly clearly in the exhibition. Really astonishing the way Vermeer's work develops. There's almost a sense of movement in the picture handle and in that woman's forearm, and you can see it very clearly here in her other arm and the effective light on the window. Look at the way he's painted this forearm, and especially look at it in the Metropolitan itself. This is a person who's just forgotten about anatomy. It's that cliche about painting what you see, not what you know. And it really works. There's basically no modeling here. It's a flat shadow with backlighting and that sort of bleed or radiance of light coming onto the forearm and the fingertips through the window. And quite an extraordinary development in the 1650s. Why this happened then, we can only speculate. I have just a few ideas which I will mention in a rapid-fire style. Part of it is chance, the happy accident of certain like-minded individuals being together at the same time. But by the way, that's part of this Vermeer. It's the contour of the skirt where the light is coming in the window, and I just wanted to make the point of how Vermeer, this is of course interest to painters, the cream is laid over the edge of the blue, and under the cream background wall, the blue is laid under the cream, so that he gets this blurred effect at the contour, and there is no contour really, just like there is in vision. And he does that by laying thinly glazed different colors slightly over each other so that there's no division between color areas. It's one of the mature techniques of Vermeer, and one of the reasons we can describe him as optical. Part of this development in Delft is the happy coincidence of like-minded painters like Paul Potter, who's in Delft briefly around 1650. He's been accused of starting the whole development, but that's obviously a cliche. I compare that painting here to the center of Vermeer's view of Delft. Part of it is the death of the court, in a sense, around 1650, when the young heir to the government, William II, the father of William III, as in William and Mary, died at the age of 22, and the government moved to Amsterdam. So that traditional touchstone of patronage in the arts in Delft, namely the court at The Hague, suddenly collapsed in 1650, and I show you an allegory of the prince's death in 1654 by Flink, and Jared Houtgeest's or Hootgeest's 5-foot panel of the tomb of William the Silent in the choir of the new church of Delft, the painting that started the whole development of realistic architectural painting in Delft in 1650, and that great picture will be in the exhibition too, with about a dozen other architectural paintings of that type. And finally, another thing, I think, is simply the fact that we're in a new generation in the 1650s, and the patrons of the 50s saw all of those earlier developments, had been seeing this rise of realism in the Netherlands, and have a much more sophisticated view of what is modern painting in the 50s than anyone could have in the 30s. So they know Delft's own Jacob van Velsen of 1631, and they know Peter de Hoogh in 1658, and they can see the connections, and they can also see what's more modern about de Hoogh between these two pictures. In general, I think Dutch painting becomes much more of a national rather than a local or regional development in the third quarter of the century. And that's partly because the court collapses as a center of patronage, and very much because Amsterdam becomes the New York of Northern Europe, the great magnet of culture and money. Major artists of the 1650s in Delft, just to mention a few briefly, again, Karel Fabricius, and these two self-portraits, both of which will be in the exhibition. These are both from the early 50s. Everything's from the early 50s with Fabricius, because he was blown up in 1654. His wonderful Sentry from Schwerin, it's never traveled before this canvas, which is about 2.5 feet high, and a wonderfully, for want of a better word, impressionistic picture. Daylight scene set by a gate in Delft. Artists with similar interests who you never heard of, but who came from Delft. Forgive me if you have, but this is Egbert van der Poel. And like I like to say to people like de Montebello, well, of course, the best van der Poel comes from Riga, doesn't it? So we have to have it. Well, that's true. This is the van der Poel from Latvia, which will be in our show. De Witte from Montreal, private collection. Emmanuel De Witte is one of the great painters of light and space of the early 50s in Delft. And I hope you see now it's not just de Hoogh and Vermeer and a few other people, but it is de Hoogh too. And this is a miraculous picture owned by that stooge, the Queen. The Card Players by Peter de Hoogh of 1658, which is just in the tiles alone, that shadow immediately in front of the figures, but really everywhere when you see the actual painting, a miracle of painting life. Speaking of miracles, Karel Fabricius' little view of Delft, which is this wide and less tall. Why would anyone painting a meticulous townscape paint a picture that size on canvas instead of wood or copper, which would have been the normal thing at the time? And here is a photo of the corresponding new church. Well, in my view, because he planted it in a viewing apparatus called the perspective box, which was a Delft creation of the period, a little peep show, except for Fabricius, it was rather more than that, as it would have been for Vermeer. It was a way of describing how we see around us in natural vision, how vision is not the same as painting. Here is the interior of the box with a copper plate that is modern. My idea of how this canvas was wrapped and glued to a stable surface. To make a long story short, there's 17th century glue on the back of this canvas, which is certainly not on its original support today, and it is laden with a copper residue, otherwise unknown to conservation history. The simple answer for why that should be is it was glued to a copper plate, which is the simplest way to make a half circle out of a canvas picture in this time. You grab an engraved copper plate, which exists in the thousands at this period, and you bang it over a pipe or something. and then you've got your curve to mount inside this illusionistic box. Here, scanning from left to right, the point of this is that you look in different directions inside the box, just as you do on a city street or in your environment. A roving eye. The right side of the picture, of course, you see what happened to the tree? Now that it's on a receding surface, and well, we'll do a mock-up of this box and we'll show it together with the painting. You'll see how illusionistic the effects become when you see that actual receding surface and don't quite understand what surface the tree is on. Here is a view through the peephole, isolating the center of this scene at a tavern with a musical instrument. It's a kind of worldly, spiritual theme going on. A painting of a church interior, actually right inside that choir, dating from the very same moment, 1651 to 2. Another extraordinary wraparound view. This is a 120-degree sweep inside a large building. Try doing that with your 55-degree lens in a camera. And these are paintings which are done virtually at the same moment in Delft in the early 50s, and it's fascinating how they're preoccupied with this wide-angle problem of actual vision. Fabricius would have painted the floor of that triangular box as well, and it would have looked something like this when it was extended onto the floor. But our computer whizzes at the Met will do a much finer version of it. And by the way, the National Gallery London cleaned the picture, so it looks more illusionistic now. Anyway, there are a lot of illusionistic murals in Delft. I don't have time to show you them now, but in fact they don't survive except for this big one by Brahmer, which is not so illusionistic anyway, but that's about 10 feet wide and popular wall decoration from Delft in 1660. This is a tapestry by that conservative history painter Calvinberg from the 30s, but this is a tapestry of the 1640s. That's as tall as a room is high. So it's actually a tapestry imitating tapestry pulled back, revealing a doorway and a room with a receding floor. There's a limit to what you can do with a tapestry, of course, woven cloth, especially a rather crude one like this. But isn't that interesting for Vermeer 20 years later, this kind of tapestry pulled to the side with a doorway, even for the art of painting, or the contrast between the silhouetted man and the woman in light across the table, and this Vermeer in the Frick collection, again, 1640, 1657. So, the question of did Vermeer use the camera obscura, for example. Here is an artist he admires from Utrecht, Honthorst, the Procurus of around 1620. I think he's taken one artist's kind of space, another artist's kind of figure arrangement and silhouetting effects, put them together, taken a fresh look at the environment and made all of those many conventions he knows more realistic. And it's a very sophisticated kind of picture making, and basically I think it has virtually nothing to do with the portable camera obscura, which probably didn't exist until the 1680s. May have had something to do with the room-type camera obscura, the shutter, hole in the shutter effect. They did exist in Vermeer's day, and he may have appreciated some effects of light and color in that device. But he sure didn't set up a room like this and then just trace or try to paint what he saw on a dimly luminous screen in front of him. In fact, he's doing a corner of the room rather like they did in Leiden in the 40s. Of course, you were about to say, what about Brecklinckong's tailor shop up in Worcester of 1653? Vermeer's clever enough to look at this picture and say, you know, if I just zoom in on the left, take a closer view as if I'm approaching those figures in an actual interior, look kind of like this, and it'll be even more realistic. I can do that. And he did do that. This is picture making as well as a miracle of observing the actual environment. And of course, these effects of light bear that out. I certainly wouldn't say this is just picture making when you look at the light coming in the window and catching those leaves in the hat, and the blaze of light on the back of that costume. Just a couple more minutes. Girl in the red hat will be in the show, which goes back to this fancy kind of trony or imaginary head, a Dutch word meaning head or expression. This is not a portrait of Vermeer's daughter or maid, or even if it is, it doesn't matter. This was a very sophisticated kind of character study and fancy dress which was sold to a connoisseur. This was a very well-known kind of picture. Rembrandt did it, many Dutch artists did it, Hendrik ter Bruggen did it in the 1620s in Utrecht. Part of the point was the miraculous description of fabrics. A person of the period would say, wow, look at that white light blazing on that fancy satin material. And what the hell kind of hat is that anyway? Is it ostrich feather? Is it, who knows? I do know that ostrich feathers were for sale in Venice in the 1650s. And this is exotic materials, very refined painting. Why is there a tapestry in the background of this picture? I think because that dull wool sets off the aesthetic effect of luminous satin and see-through feathers or fur or whatever it is in the hat. And as for the alignment of the finials on the chair, if they are the same chair back at all, it could be two chairs. I think Vermeer just put those pieces of furniture wherever they looked good in this picture and is not so worried about what David Hockney would say was done with some kind of lens or what Arthur Liedtke would say is done with a camera obscura. They're right in part, but they're missing the artist by stressing these rather 19th century perceptions. Look at what de Hohlt does, for example. He comes from Haarlem, he paints these early stable interiors, and then when he moves to Delft, he gets with this kind of picture. He's basically getting with the local program. They love perspective down in this neighborhood, and they like a more classical kind of composition. You may notice a similarity between these two rooms, but then you notice the differences. It's not quite the same. Apparently someone's built a partition on the left and remodeled the place a bit, or maybe de Hohlt is a painter who just makes these things up as he goes along, and he's a hell of a painter when you look at a detail like this. What is that conservative portrait in the background painted on? It's painted on a wood panel with vertical planks, probably oak, not the pine or softer wood which you see shining with light on the doorway, which is open. Probably not the humbler wood, whatever it is, of the closed shutter with the little pinpoints of light showing through the cracks of it. I mean, just the four panes of the window in the back would justify doing a painting today. I think it's kind of essay in different light effects, which a dog or a cat, this is a dog, might pause and just, you have a cat, you know the way they sit on the windowsill and just look at the light changing out in the square or whatever. I always think of that when I look at the shine on the tiles here, these parallelograms of light in this wonderful de Hohlt maternal duty, as it's called, which is the theme of the picture. Peter de Hohlt coming from Amsterdam to our show. And really it is the last 5 minutes now. These two pictures in the show, two great courtyard scenes by Peter de Hohlt in 1658 from London and a private collection in New York. Very fortunate to get this. You see the relationship and how he's changed not only the architecture but the very theme from one of domestic to a more courtly or courtship at least theme, although it's still basically a painting which is about the good life in Delft. They've moved neighborhoods. The whole house has been carried off to a different kind of canal and the archway remodeled. But the wall on the left here, you see the wall on the right rather, with its plaster and that sort of snowball effect of lime leaching or plaster, I'm not sure which. And then you look at this painting in Washington, there's that same wall. They sold the damn wall to another house. You see it's in the background, it's sort of the same doorway. So, well, maybe this is a portrait of a wall, but de Hohlt uses it in whatever picture he would like to. This picture would not have happened in Vermeer's career if it were not for Peter de Hoog's influence around 1658. They'll both be in New York together, and it's Vermeer's, of course, most domestic picture, and a painting which a painter of the period would have called schilderachtig, which means painter-like, or painterly, or pictorial values in our sense. They love brick walls. They see these kind of textures and color effects and focus effects and all that the way you do. I really believe that. They were formalists in a sense, or they knew paint and loved texture. Of course they did. I mean, all of these effects wouldn't be so beautiful and exist. But sometimes I think in the discussion of Dutch painting, these artistic values are sort of swept under the table carpet in favor of Svetlana Alper's reductive thesis of what the art of describing is all about. We will have the first 4 Vermeers in our exhibition, Diana and her companions from The Hague, and Christ in the House of Mary and Martha from Edinburgh. 2 pictures where you can really see earlier Delft paintings continuation in the early pictures of Vermeer around 1653. Does this picture look a little odd to you on the left, slightly unfamiliar? That's because the sky to the upper right, which has been there for 200 years, turns out to be a 19th century addition and is now painted over to simulate the original 17th century condition, which is still under the paint, but rather too hazardous to remove that sky. So they've extended the foliage, and it's really changed the composition quite a bit to a more classical design, something quieter, more meditative. And for the first time, some clever guy at the Metropolitan Museum has identified not only Diana and her companions, but Callisto in the background, who, according to the tale by Ovid, was pregnant by Jupiter, who shows up in the form of some transformation, I forget which, and gets her pregnant. And this is an all-girl band here, and you're not allowed to be pregnant to run with Diana through the woods. And Diana, according to Ovid, has just said, we're hot and bothered, let's strip and bathe in the stream here. And one of the young ladies, according to Ovid, the Roman poet of 80 AD, gets very shy and quiet and sort of hunches up and refuses to take her clothes off while these other girls are half undressed or about to be, and that's Callisto. So this is quite a serious mythological picture about domestic virtue in the year that Vermeer married, which is interesting. This Procurus from Dresden, which has never traveled before, will be in our exhibition, which is quite a coup, and I say that gratefully, not proudly, because this is a large Utrecht-style 5-foot wide canvas by Vermeer from Dresden, which has been there since the early 1800s, and except for one very brief trip to East Berlin in the commie days, has never been out of Dresden before. And let's see what else is here. Our own Made Asleep, the first interior of the more familiar type by Vermeer, which we'll compare to those pictures. Our own lute player. These 2 paintings from London, sort of good girl, bad girl pendants. Imagine you've got a date with these babes, and you walk in, and it's sort of 6 in the afternoon, and you've got high hopes, and which is going to be the easier proposition? That's what this, you know, and I don't know why. I mean, Vermeer is subtle and refined, and, you know, normally you might wonder what I'm about when I interpret Vermeer like that. And I see everything else in Vermeer, but I think Vermeer has been sanctified in a way which is alien to the period. And this is often done, oddly enough, in the name of social context. And they don't see the social context that these pictures were all sold to wealthy men, and that they would first see in these beautiful pictures an attractive woman in a fancy, rather luxurious home. This is like Vogue magazine and Architectural Digest in one shot, with you know, a 5% dash of Playboy. That's how that's how it read to an average male viewer at the time, I think, who also saw everything we love in Vermeer and was more sophisticated as well. I just want to briefly show you a couple of other pictures. Hendrik van Vliet, the art of painting. This is the point. The art of painting, which 2 weeks ago we secured after 14 months of monkeying around with the director in Vienna. I hope he's not here tonight. 4-foot-high canvas that Vermeer kept in his own possession from the moment he painted it around 1666 to his death 9 years later, and then his wife refused to sell it, and was, I think, a picture meant to be kept in a studio. It's an imaginary scene of Vermeer's own studio, kept in Vermeer's own studio. And it was essentially to show visiting connoisseurs what he could do. There's this famous story about a French diplomat showing up a few years before he painted this picture, and not one Vermeer was in the house to show him. He was sent off to a master baker to see a picture, a kind of an industrialist, and then was shocked at the price of it. So this seems to be Vermeer's own imaginary testament of what his own world was like. But when you were in Vermeer's attic studio, you would have seen that, in fact, this guy's got a hell of an imagination as well as an ability to observe and paint. Illusionistic curtains of this kind, you see in other Delft paintings like this one by Vliet. Perspective like this you see in wild paintings like this Delft picture by Fosmar, a view through an imaginary front porch or arcade in 1663. Similar genre paintings, Cornelis de Man at about the same time, the mid-60s. Someone in the back row said, what about Johannes Kuzermans? Yes, we'll have one of his too. This grisaille painting of a church interior. It's actually a pen painting. And we'll have this, which you will look at again and again and again. And it's a very sophisticated painting, and that's part of the story of Delft, and a very natural painting too. And I'm worn out, that's enough. Thank you.